For the next about 25 to 30 minutes, I'll be talking about the new research center, which I'm launching this summer, which is called the Darknet and Anonymity Research Center. And so the goal of my presentation today is to talk about the research center, but also about some of the research that we can do using a center like the one that I'm building this summer. So basically, the quest for this center, or the quest for this research topic, started a few years back when I had actually my first master student, who is Masara Paquet-Clouston, and she had an economics background, and it was really kind of mind blowing to see how people in the economy could really conceptualize markets and how they could really push us forward in criminology to help us understand how markets work. And turns out that the work that we did to assess competition in online illicit markets really worked out. We have a few published papers with Masara, and she was named one of the next 150, I think, scientific innovators or something like this. But it really proved that this kind of interdisciplinary research really worked and that there was something that we could look into. And so, not long after this, I had the opportunity to apply for funding for the Canada Foundation for Innovation. And basically, this is an organization that will give you money to set up a research lab. For the people who are not familiar with it, it doesn't give you actually any money to run your lab, so you're kind of on your own after they've given you this amazing place to work in. But you actually have to kind of find funding to keep it going. But they will provide you with anywhere between 200 and $400,000 Canadian dollars to buy a lot of toys, computers, servers, standing desk if that's your thing, whatever you need. Basically, they're going to provide you with. And today I'll be talking about what we plan to do with this and kind of the research problem that we want to answer using this infrastructure. And also because we always have to advertise for something, I'll also be looking for partners if Jeremy or other people want to join in. I'm always open for collaborations. So basically, the Darknet and Anonymity Research Center, because you always need a good acronym to get funding. So that's why we went with the dark name. And basically, what we looked at was the current state of crime and technology, and what we've seen over the past, perhaps I would say 20 or 30 or 40 years, is the adoption of computer-mediated communications by offenders, and this has taken on many forms. Used to be BBS, used to be chat rooms. It still is chat rooms. It still is discussion forums. It's moved on to encrypted apps. I know Asmus has worked also on even social networks like Facebook. It's pretty amazing the number of offenders you can find just on Facebook or even Tinder. And so what we've witnessed is basically this shift and this adoption of computer-mediated communications by offenders. And of course, as I just said, there are many mediums through which they communicate, many settings in which they communicate. You're going to have a broad range of communication channels. Some of them will be very public. For example, hack forums, which has been studied extensively in the literature, has millions and millions of participants, and it's pretty open. Pretty much anyone can join in and can just chat with other people. And you have beginner hackers and very experienced hackers working on that platform. But you also have other platforms like Benoit has studied in the past with Darkcode, for example, where you have a much more private communication channel where basically a very select few people are going to talk together and you have to apply to be included into this communications channel. And we've seen that these communication channel has been used to communicate, to share ideas, to share techniques. It's going to improve each other's techniques to do cybercrime, but also and very often to trade, so to buy and sell illicit products and services. And this is not something that's new. It's been around for decades. It used to be that people were trading. These days, there's a lot more economic framework around it, meaning that people are going to buy stuff. They're going to buy, for example, hacking services. They're going to buy illicit drugs. They are going to buy whatever, even wildlife trading, illicit wildlife products. You can buy pretty much anything on the internet these days, and it's through mostly these communication channels that this is going to happen. And just part of the funding, because you always need to kind of raise awareness about how important what you're studying is. Just put in, a few numbers here, and I'm sure all of you are already convinced how terrible these online illicit markets are for Canada. But we hear about these numbers, and Benoit is studying how real are these numbers. But we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars that are lost every year in Canada because of financial fraud that is facilitated in part by these online illicit markets. We see a very vast increase of this problematic over the past decade, so tripling of losses since 2008. And this is all linked as well to identity fraud, which has proven to be a very big problem, at least in the financial industry, where people apply, for example, for mortgages with fake identity, and then the bank loses hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so there have been a lot of implications for Canada around this theme of online illicit markets, and this can be involved, with computer hacking, illicit drug sales, and as I said, even illicit wildlife training. And why do offenders go on these online illicit markets? Why have they adopted these online illicit markets? There's a few reasons that are very easy to understand. First of all, the criminal on the ground is a pretty chaotic environment. But using these communication channels, they can actually bring in order. You're going to have platform administrators that are going to make sure that there are some ground rules that everyone is supposed to follow, even though they don't always follow those rules. But at least there's someone kind of giving out a sense for this is how things should work, and people can rely on these rules and can kind of refer to them when there's a problem. These online illicit markets also facilitate networking, just because I was talking about hack forums where there's millions of people that are interacting with each other. Many of these platforms actually have thousands, if not tens of thousands, of participants that are going to be exchanging ideas, buying from each other, and it becomes pretty easy if you have hacking services to sell, if you have a DDoS service that you want to sell. Well, if you want to put your name out there and you want to make sure that people know what you're selling. Using these online illicit markets, it's pretty easy to do just because so many people are going to be reading your post and looking at what you're doing. And finally, they really reduce the asymmetry of information, meaning that in the illicit world, it's very difficult to know if you're going to be buying a good illicit product or not, and if what you're buying is exactly what you ask for. And with these online illicit markets, you actually have some feedback, and you kind of know what people have said about vendors in the past, and can kind of get some information about who you're dealing with before you have to deal with them. At the same time, there are many issues with these online illicit markets. For me, these things have been just great for research purposes, just because it's really a one-stop shop where I can just deploy a crawler, go in and download tons of information about what offenders are doing, and this has been very helpful, for example, for illicit drug studies. We can actually get very, very accurate prices for drugs in specific countries. And this is something that we've never had before. So how much is cannabis in Canada versus Australia? And what we see is that these online prices kind of reflect what we see in the streets. And so it becomes something that's very interesting for us researchers, but at the time it's kind of problematic for the offenders because they want to remain anonymous. They don't want to have their activities kind of put out publicly. But using these online illicit markets, researchers can actually just display everything that's going on in this illicit market. We've also seen a very high prevalence for opportunistic behavior among online illicit markets participants. I said that they were administrators that were managing these online illicit markets, but actually what we see is that the power of these administrators is very low, particularly in these open platforms where pretty much anyone can register, and even if they get banned, then the person can just register a new account, and it becomes very difficult for the administrators to kind of keep some sense of order in their own market, and it becomes very difficult for them to manage kind of everyone who's in there. Finally, and that's probably kind of the biggest issue with these online illicit markets, is these have become very high value target for law enforcement agencies. We've seen a number of police operations that are targeting these online illicit markets, and as soon as you deal online on these illicit markets, you have a target in your back, and you realize that if law enforcement is able to seize the servers hosting these online illicit markets, then all of a sudden they have your messages, they're going to have your IP addresses, they're going to have a lot of information about you, and we've seen a lot of arrests of participants just because the servers that were hosting these markets were seized, and because there's information about them that's just leaking online. We saw this example, for example, that was more than a decade ago, I believe, with the Shadow Crew forum, where actually the police was running the actual forum where offenders were selling and buying credit card numbers, and they even had a VPN service that was hosted on their secret service in the United States server, so they could actually see all the connections coming through and from this forum, and they were telling the offenders, this is a very secure VPN. No one can hack in. Well, no one needed to hack in just because the police was running it by themselves. So, we were talking earlier with Jeremy about, are offenders smart? Are people smart and how they use technology? And very often we see that they don't really use technology as they should. But still, a lot of offenders figured out that, technology could be a solution to these security issues, and that, if they wanted to lock down, for example, their activities and protect their privacy and their anonymity, they could actually use technology to achieve this. And so of course, so there's the Tor network, which you can use to hide your identity, which also can be used by websites, so by these online illicit markets, to hide where their servers are. So you can basically have a website on the internet and no one knows where it's located, so it's basically impossible to take it down or to seize it if you're law enforcement. And you can also hide yourself as well, so you can protect your IP address from anyone who wants to snoop around. You can also encrypt your communications, so you can actually make sure that only the person you want to communicate with can actually read your messages. And this is using GPG, PGP, whatever is your preferred method for encrypting messages. But this is really a game changer, because even if you seize a server, because all the messages are encrypted, it's no longer possible to decrypt these messages and to know what people said and what they exchanged, what information they exchanged, and what they did. The last point is the virtual currencies, which we just talked about extensively. And we always talk about Monero, Zcash, Ethereum, Bitcoin, but there's actually thousands of them out there. There's DentaCoin, which is used by dentists. If you want to make payments for your dentist, you actually have a coin just for that. And so there's a coin for pretty much anything that you want to do. But these virtual currencies, even though they do leak a lot of information, they can actually allow you to make payments. And one of the most important things for offenders is that these payments are going to be, in most cases, anonymous, but they're also going to be irreversible, which means that as soon as you receive the payment, there's no way for the person to take the money back from you. So if I sell you credit card numbers, well, as soon as I have the payment, I can send you the credit card numbers, and I know that you can't really take the money back. And all these technologies have created a problem which is called the going dark problem, and we can debate later on about whether this is a problem or not. But law enforcement has been very vocal about this problem, about this going dark problem, which means that police actually have to work to get information and get evidence from offenders. And it used to be kind of easy, so we just monitor the phone line of someone, their internet traffic, and you could actually get a lot of information about where people were, what they were doing, who they were talking to. And because of these new technologies, it becomes a lot more difficult for law enforcement to do their job and to actually gather evidence. And what we see is that using these technologies, the ability to intercept communications really decreases for law enforcement. It becomes much more difficult for them to actually monitor what people are saying to each other. But also for us researchers, unfortunately, it becomes a lot more difficult to gather information about who is saying what to whom, just because all this information is going to be encrypted. And we've had example of offenders even recently. There's this case in Quebec with Renal Desjardins, who planned a murder, and he was exchanging and talking about the murder on BlackBerry, and he and his colleagues believed that because they were talking on a BlackBerry, it was all secure and there was nothing that the police could do to monitor their communications. Turns out, actually, BlackBerry isn't that secure, at least for just regular users, and they got arrested, and he had to plead guilty to murder. But so this is kind of like an easy way to solve a murder, but if they had been using WhatsApp, for example, it would have been much more difficult to gather evidence and to arrest them, and for us researchers as well, it's more difficult to get information. A point that's been very useful even for law enforcement and for us researchers is just the metadata. I saw research recently with researchers that were looking at the EXIF data of pictures on online illicit markets, and they were looking for digital traces on these images, and they were able to link these images together to find out that, these two vendor accounts on a market, they don't have the same vendor name, but we can pretty accurately say that these pictures came from the same person, so it's probably the same person dealing these two under these two vendor names. But even getting access to this metadata is much more difficult because it's all encrypted, basically. It's much more difficult to follow where people are, what they do with, at least in the virtual world, because of the Tor network, for example. We don't even know who's visiting what websites, what they're doing on these websites. We don't even know where these websites are. And so for law enforcement, for us, when we're trying to monitor what people are doing and to better model kind of the behavior of offenders, it becomes much more difficult to do our job. Also, the monetary flows, we can use to some extent Bitcoin to track payments, and that's what I've been doing and working on lately, is just looking at the flows of Bitcoins in and out of online illicit markets, for example. But with Zcash, with Monero, it becomes almost impossible to really follow these monetary flows and to see how much money is going into these online illicit markets, what's the behavior, what's the profile of the people who are making purchases. And so it becomes much more difficult for me to do my job as a researcher, or actually I have to work more to get the same data, and it's the same for law enforcement. We can skip this, not really important. And so in the end, it kind of becomes just more difficult for everyone to collect either evidence or research data and to kind of get an understanding of what are offenders doing and how are they doing it, no matter what your purpose is. And so when we look and we listen to law enforcement, what we hear, the picture that we get is kind of like this apocalyptic picture of how it's going to be impossible from now on to, arrest anyone, to convict anyone. Everyone's going to just walk free. There's going to be anarchy, building burning. And so there's really this really big kind of framing of this problem as this is a really big problem for society, this going dark problem. And personally, I'm not sure that, it's such a big problem that, we're all going to die. But it still raises a lot of questions, and that is kind of the point that I want to make with this research center, is to look at to understand and to explain the impact of these anonymous technologies. So as I mentioned, encryption, the darknet, virtual currencies, and other technology that are going to rise in the future. But what is going to be the impact of these technologies on offenders, on offenses, on online illicit markets, and how we as researchers research these settings, and how law enforcement, for example, is trying to regulate these markets. And so we're going to have kind of three different branches or three different axes that we're going to study. The first one, is monitoring the evolution of an anonymous technology. And this is where, if Jerry's team wants to step in and jump in, that's the beauty of it. We have lots of research funds to do these kind of things. But trying to understand, right now we have kind of a good grasp of what technologies are. But for us in social sciences, it's often very difficult to understand these new technologies. Just, I was asking a question earlier about Zcash and Monero. These are very subtle differences, and it becomes very difficult for us social sciences researchers to really understand, well, why are they using Monero? What is the impact of using Monero? And I hear there was this problem with the protocol that, leaked a lot of information. And so the first thing that we want to do is keep an eye for the next 4 years about what technologies are out there that kind of help people to protect their privacy, their anonymity, even if it's not being used by offenders, just kind of knowing what technology is out there, how it works, and how it could be used by offenders to kind of protect themselves. So that's kind of the first part of it, and our goal is to publish every 4 months or maybe every 6 months, kind of a report online and saying, this is what we've seen over the past few months, just to keep everyone up to date. This is where we currently stand with these anonymity and privacy technologies. The second thing we want to look at is, well, how do you learn about these technologies? Why do you adopt them? And this is where we look more at explain the adoption of anonymous technologies by offenders and trying to understand, well, a lot of offenders use these cryptocurrencies, but a much larger number is not. And so we hear a lot of pimps using cryptocurrencies. We see drug dealers using cryptocurrencies. Well, why are these guys using cryptocurrencies and not other people? And so we want to kind of do interviews with offenders and trying to understand how did you hear about these technologies? Do you know the pros and cons? Do you know how to use them properly? How do you use them? Are there issues when you're using them? And so kind of model the adoption rate and how they adopt these technologies by offenders. The third thing that we want to see is kind of in a very broad way is, what is the impact of these technologies on online illicit markets? So as I said, there's a lot of online illicit markets out there. Some of them are on the darknet, some of them are on the open internet. And do the darknet markets, for example, are they growing more rapidly than the clearnet market? Are they growing in a different way? Are they hosting different content? How is these technologies shaping these markets by their size, their scope, the number of people who are participating in them, what they're being used for, how they're growing, and how they're being used by offenders. So there's a lot of questions about, do these technologies really matter? Do they protect offenders from victimization, from law enforcement? Does it change the way that we as researchers are going to research these online illicit markets? Does it change how police operate against these online illicit markets? So it's a very broad question that we want to answer. And so the goal of the lab was to bring together people from social sciences, from criminology, but also from business school, and also people from computer science. So I'll let you decide which picture shows computer science and which one shows a business school. But the goal is to have kind of partnership with people in economy, because we're trying to understand markets. And so if you want to understand markets, you really need to have economists on board to really help you model how these markets operate, their size and scope, competition. But you also need to have people in computer science to actually help you collect the data, help you understand these technologies, because many times they're very complicated, and to really sort out kind of technical kinks and to help you understand these technologies. So that's what I've done for this lab. So we have a partner from HEC, from the business school, and we also have a partner from ETS, who is more on the computer science side. But we're really open, once again, and I will say this about 20 times in this presentation. If more people want to jump in, we're always looking for partners, and we have tons of funding, which is always nice to have. So basically what we want to do is do some open source monitoring, which means look, even down to Google News, just for looking at, what technology is out there. When we want to understand the new technologies, how they're being used, looking at forums, looking at Reddit, and looking just in the news, what, new startup came up with what technology. So use open source monitoring, which is kind of very manual, labor intensive work. But also using my data crypto research infrastructure, which is kind of a web crawler and scraper, which Rasmus is helping me improve these days. But just to collect massive amount of information, either from Reddit, from forums, from online illicit markets, maybe online social networks as well. But basically to get all this information in a centralized database that we can easily analyze. And I always think that a year from now, we're going to have this amazing setup where we can kind of visualize in 3D all the data that we have. And I guess we're still 1 year away from this, Rasmus, is what I would say. We'll get there 1 year from now, but it's still a pretty cool data collection infrastructure that we have. And finally, to do interviews. It's never very easy to interview offenders. We ran a survey with online drug dealers last year, which worked out pretty well. And the point is to continue these interviews and build on what we've done and the credibility that we have in the community to be able to interview offenders and to really understand, well, how do you hear about Bitcoin? Why are you using it? Why are you not using it? And are you afraid of by using it that you're going to get caught? Or does that protect you, or does that expose you in your mind? This is going to be kind of the research center. It's a very fancy name for a very small lab. So it's basically kind of 8 workstations. The thing that I'm most excited about is that we're going to have the wall to the right is going to be just a huge white wall where we can, draw and just have fun with it. From ceiling to floor, it's going to be one huge whiteboard that we can use. So I'm very excited about this. But other than that, it's just, 8 workstations. We're going to have a lot of server spaces with Calcul Quebec, which has been very kind to host all of our infrastructure, all of our virtual infrastructure. And there will be a coffee machine as well for people who want to visit us. And maybe some beer, but I don't think I'm allowed to say this publicly if that will be the case or not for university purposes. So basically what we can do is the goal of this lab is to look at a very, very broad range of questions, and just to give you, I mean, how far this can, this can range. And I talk about, business school, I talk about computer science, but we just got a paper accepted in the British Medical Journal about prescription opioids and how people are using the darknet to sell these prescription opioids. And just to give you an example, I mean, just involving even people, in medicine in all departments is the thing that I'm looking forward to. And here you kind of have a graph that shows you the distribution of drugs being sold on the darknet. And if you look to the right, the upper right, you're going to see like a big jump in this purple area, and that's all the prescription opioids being sold on the darknet. And a colleague of mine realized that, it's kind of strange how they weren't selling all that much, but all of a sudden, the proportion of prescription opioids being sold just really exploded. And we realized that this in the United States there was a big problem. I don't think I'm teaching you anything when I'm telling you there's a big opioid prescription problem in the United States. We can see just how much prescriptions have increased over the past few years. And what we decided is, we figured maybe we could use the darknet data to try and understand this model. So here you have kind of the data crypto that we have and that we use. So we have about 33 different online darknet markets that we collected data from that we just pulled in all together to look at all the drugs that are being sold on the darknet. And what we realized was actually that, this jump could be explained by a scheduling change, which means that in the United States in 2014, it actually became much more difficult if you want to get prescription opioids to get your doctor to prescribe you opioids. And what we saw is, and you have the line here to the left, is kind of the before and after, and the one line you should look at is kind of the pink line, the pink dotted line. And it shows that, the proportion of sales of prescription opioids was pretty stable before this scheduling change. But after this scheduling change, what we witnessed is that when we were looking at vendors from the United States on the darknet dealing prescription opioids, we saw that their sales vastly increased in the months that followed this scheduling change. And when we look at internationally, if you look at this same kind of pink line, when we look at international vendors, so people who are not dealing from the United States, what we figured is that their prevalence and the proportion of sales coming from them remained pretty flat. So it was kind of interesting to see that actually the scheduling change in the United States impacted the darknet, impacted online illicit markets. People who were getting their prescription opioids through pharmacies no longer could do it. And what they did is that they maybe switched to darknet markets to provide them with their opioids that they wanted to get. So that's the kind of research that we can do. And of course, we're not explaining anything. It's always kind of a correlation, an explanation. But it's very clear from the data that we have that there's a very strong correlation between these two. And this becomes really interesting because what we see is ordinary people who are getting these opioids prescribed that maybe are learning about Bitcoins, learning about online markets, and going online to purchase these drugs to supply their habit. And that's kind of interesting to see how people can pick it up very quickly, and how legitimate people or just normal people actually can master these technologies. And so I'm at 30 minutes flush, so I will stop now. And once again, all you business school people and computer science people, you're welcome to join us. Just drop me an email and I'll be very happy to talk with you. So thank you.